So thank you so much for joining. It's early here on the West Coast. It's late in the day in Paris, and we are so honored to have Dr. Anna Persic, who's a program specialist at the Science Policy Innovation Policy section at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, where I had the delight to be with her in March for an open science event. She's an ecologist by training with a PhD in ecotoxicology. She joined UNESCO in April 2006 in the framework of UNESCO's Man and the Biosphere program within the Division of Ecological and Earth Sciences in Paris. She then served as a science specialist at the UNESCO Liaison Office in New York from 2011 to 2018. And her work relates to strengthening the science policy interface and promoting science, technology, and innovation and implementing the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Sustainable Development Goals. She coordinated the work to develop the UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science and is currently working on its implementation of UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science. And without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Dr. Persic.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thanks to everybody for joining us this morning for you. It's with great pleasure that I received this invitation to present the UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science. I think it's an interesting piece of, it's an interesting document, and it's an interesting legal instrument that can be used really to promote kind of an equitable open science across the world, and the way in which science would need to be done ideally, the way the science would need to be carried out around the world. So I'll start sharing my my screen. Okay, so just to start the presentation by explaining a little bit why at UNESCO, which is the UN agency for the agency of the United Nations for Education, Science, Culture and Communication, we were interested in this issue of open science. Basically, we've seen that the different challenges that we are facing today are very complex, very much interconnected, and to be able to provide solutions for these challenges, we need a scientific community that is very vibrant, that is very innovative, that is very collaborative, and it is also very connected amongst themselves and also with the broader society. In the open science, we really found this idea of a movement that would transform and democratize the entire scientific process, increase access to scientific information, but also fulfill the human right to science. So the idea with open science is not only that we open access to the outputs of science, to the results of science, like open access to publications or open data, but really to kind of try and see how open science and open science principles can be embedded in different parts of the scientific methods and the scientific circle. Again, open science, of course, allows for the scientific information to be more broadly distributed, accessible, that can be used for different purposes by different audiences. It can really be a true great game changer to bridge the science technology innovation gaps that we see not only between countries, but also within countries. And in this context, we are thinking about the Declaration of Human Rights, within which there is a human right to enjoy the benefits of science and participate in the scientific process. And it is a human right that really is important, particularly in today's day and age, where we really have science, technology, innovation that are an incredibly important part of our lives, and also that are shaping the way that the society is going forward and addressing some of the challenges. And as for us at the United Nations, it was important because we see open science also as a possible accelerator for the achievement of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, that, as probably you know, go from ending poverty, ensuring health for all, ensuring also the fighting the climate change, biodiversity loss, inequalities, etc. So we have this sustainable development agenda that is very broad, and we do see open science as an accelerator for its achievement across different countries. So, of course, we've seen different movements of open science within different communities and in different parts of the world coming up more and more frequently within the last few decades. But we did not have until very recently an international policy and action framework. We did not have a common definition of what open science is. We did not have a shared set of values and principles. And that is the reason why the 193 member states of UNESCO decided to task the organization, UNESCO, to come up with what we call a UNESCO Recommendation on Open Science, which is a legal instrument that needs to be at a certain point negotiated by member states and adopted by member states, and in which the General Conference, which is the body where all our member states come together, formulates principles and norms for international regulation of a certain matter, in this case, open science. And even if it's not a legally binding instrument as a convention, it really is an important instrument that shapes the practices in different member states, and member states are required to report back to UNESCO every 4 years on the progress that it's made. So in 2019, 193 member states decided that open science does have a potential to accelerate sustainable development goals and bridge the science technology innovation gaps that exist, and task UNESCO to come up with this recommendation, with this document, with this text that would then be adopted by all the member states, and they did adopt it in 2021 at the UNESCO General Conference in November in 2021. So the process to develop the recommendation, as I said, our member states asked us to develop it in 2019 with the view of adopting it in 2021. So we had 2 years to really conduct a very consultative, inclusive, transparent, and multi-stakeholder process to develop the text of this recommendation, to understand what different communities intend by open science, to understand what their challenges are, what the different opportunities may be, also with regards to the different regional differences and realities. It was extremely important for us that we really do these consultations in all the different parts of the world, in particular in developing countries. So we've had huge amounts of consultations through online surveys, through regional consultations, thematic consultations with different actors, young scientists, citizen science actors, academies, science unions, data organizations. And here CoData really had a very important role to play, because they really did provide a lot of inputs on what the data community was kind of considering as open science in the context of open data, and provided this input for us to integrate into the text of the recommendation. Then once we've put together from all these different inputs the draft text of this recommendation, we had intergovernmental negotiations. So the member states came together, negotiated the text, and the final text was adopted by all our 193 member states at the UNESCO General Conference in November 2021. So this UNESCO recommendation on open science is important because it is the first international normative instrument on open science. As I said, it contains the first internationally agreed definition of what open science is, spells out the core values and the guiding principles for open science. It already defines and then also addresses multiple actors and stakeholders of open science. It recommends actions at different levels, and again, for different actors to operationalize the principles of open science, proposes different approaches for open science at different stages of the scientific cycle, and also calls for a development of a comprehensive open science monitoring framework. In terms of the definition that was put forward in the recommendation, it's quite broad, and it actually does put together all kinds of different parts of openness of science. So it defines it as an ensemble of different movements which make scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everybody, that increase scientific collaborations and sharing of information for the benefits of science and of society, and opens the process of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community. So as I was saying, the idea is that we're opening science within the scientific community, but also beyond the scientific community. There was a lot of discussions as to what are the different pillars and elements of open science. And the final agreement was on the 4 key pillars: open scientific knowledge, open science infrastructures, open engagement of other societal actors, open dialogue with other knowledge systems, and all that kind of supported by science communication more broadly. So within the context of open scientific knowledge, of course, we have open access, open data, open educational resources, open source software and source code, and open hardware. And then for each one of the different elements of the open science as defined in the recommendation, there is a little definition that is provided in the recommendation. And these definitions are important because it really does kind of put everybody on the same page in terms of understanding what these different elements are, and then throughout the recommendation, what needs to be done to make sure that they contribute to open science in an equitable manner. Just a little bit on the open research data from the recommendation, because I think this is the community that would be interested in that. They include, according to the recommendation, digital analog data, raw, processed, accompanying metadata, numerical scores, textual records, images, sound, protocol that can be openly used, reused, retained, and redistributed by anyone subject to acknowledgement. So again, even in this context, there is a broad definition of what research data are. They're available in timely and user-friendly human and machine readable and actionable format. And then, of course, we talk very much about the FAIR principles for open research data: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but also CARE principles for indigenous governance of data, or for the governance of indigenous data. So collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And indeed, throughout the recommendation, there are these ethical components that come up as strongly as the technical ones do. So of course, the quality of research is still the paramount for open science, but it also is what is the impact on society, and what are the ethical dimensions of how we do open science, how we do science more broadly. We talk about in the recommendation as open as possible, as closed as necessary. I'm sure you're very familiar with the concept, stating very clearly that it's not all the information, all the data that has to be put online without any restrictions, without any regulations, without any control in a way. Access can be restricted to protect human rights, confidentiality, intellectual property rights, personal information, threatened or endangered species, or sacred and secret indigenous knowledge. However, even in the contexts where data sharing is restricted, or access to data is restricted in a way, the recommendation really pushes forward collaborations within communities on certain data and information more broadly, and also the development of community protocols on how the data should be shared, how the information should be shared, who benefits from it, how is it acknowledged, and how do we work with all the information that is available. I was talking about the values and principles, and again, there was a lot of discussion on what these values and principles are. Quality and integrity, collective benefit, equity and fairness, diversity and inclusiveness came out as the key values for open science, and then a series of principles to basically operationalize these values, which should be respected within any open science practice or method that can be can be used. Kind of the operational part of the recommendation looks into some areas of actions and actually proposes actions at different levels and for different actors. Member states in particular, they're the key audience, but then also, of course, within member states, different authorities and different actors, including, of course, scientists in institutions, but also with some recommendations to publishers and other actors in the scientific system. The areas of action cover different fields, from the promotion of a common understanding of open science to the development of an enabling policy environment and creation of policies for open science, or integration of principles of open science in the existing science, technology, innovation policies. Of course, investment in human resources, in infrastructures and services, promotion of cooperation, innovative approaches, and overall fostering of a culture of open science, which now we realize is probably the most important action that needs to take place across different disciplines, actors, across different parts of the world. So since November 2021, at UNESCO and together with a variety of different partners and experts, we've been working on kind of promoting the recommendation, making it known to different communities and different actors, but also trying to understand what are the key challenges with a transformation to a culture of open science and open science in different scientific institutions and areas. We do see as a key challenge the need to change the conventional scientific culture, which still is quite connected to more conventional closed science, let's say, values and principles. And this is very tightly connected to the need to align incentives and criteria for evaluation of scientific excellence and scientific careers. Particularly for young scientists, it is very difficult for them to invest themselves in open science practices, while the way in which their scientific careers are evaluated does not necessarily include open science as a value factor or as factors that are valued for advancement of their careers. And we still have evaluations that are based on impact factors and other other factors which, again, are not necessarily aligned with the open science principles and values. There is need to build human and institutional capacity in terms of open science, needs to develop and invest in adequate infrastructures, and in particular, reliable internet connectivity. This is particularly true for developing countries, but also for a lot of different marginalized scholars or others who want to be part of open science movement, because it relies so much on digital infrastructures and internet connectivity. It is very important that open science actions are always accompanied also with those that promote internet connectivity. Alignment of incentives and revision of criteria for evaluation of scientific excellence and scientific careers. I talked about that, and it really is a big challenge right now in the scientific community in particular. And then addressing some of these unintended negative consequences of open science practices. The article processing charges in the context of open access is one of those unintended negative consequences. There can be others, including, for example, the extraction of data or misuse of open research data. Again, there are ways to address these challenges. There are different and growing number of initiatives and practices that can be used to address these challenges, but we have to be aware of them as we move forward with the implementation of the UNESCO recommendation and open science more broadly. So we see really capacity building, policy development, financing incentives, infrastructures, and monitoring as the most important issues that need to be addressed to be able to move forward with open science. And we have around ourselves gathered these working groups, there are 5 working groups focusing on these particular issues. open working groups. If you're interested, you're very welcome to join us, that are looking into some of these issues, unpacking some of these challenges, and trying to provide guidance, particularly to member states, as to how to move forward with open science. So at the international level, we are in this regard developing a series of supporting tools, technical briefs, fact sheets, guidelines, and others, trying to collect and map existing open science policies and strategies, collect and share best practices or diverse practices, analyzing open science financing mechanism and incentives, and what's the best way of funding for open science and incentivizing open science, promoting open science infrastructures, building capacity, and building this monitoring framework for open science. We rely on our partners, we rely on experts around the world. We have a global open science partnership. We have a steering committee, which brings together people from different parts of the world. And then we have these open science working groups that are regularly meeting to provide technical advice on some of these issues that I've been talking about. So we've been producing this open science toolkit. It's open. We're still building different pieces of the toolkit. We have some guides, we have some checklists, fact sheets. We are working on some open indexes. Again, the idea really is to gather the information that is already existing on open science, try to unpack some of these issues and some of these terms that we are using in the context of open science, and try to build a community of practice around open science. We are thinking, after the meeting that we've had in Paris that Christine was referring to, also producing a guide on the use of data, open data, particularly in times of crisis. So this is also something that we will be working on in the coming days. We are going to do another guide on engagement with society, and particularly in terms of data gathering. This is becoming an important point through citizen science, voluntary science, and other ways of engagement with society, particularly in the context of data collection and data sharing. We are also working with the World Intellectual Property Organization to produce a guide on the connections between intellectual property rights and regimes and open science. Many people see them as opposites. What we are arguing, and WIPO is arguing, that they can absolutely coexist, open science and of course intellectual property. There is a balance to be made, taking into account different factors, but it's not necessarily either you do open science and you open everything, either you close everything so that you can produce your patents and benefit commercially from your research. So I think that the discussion is much more nuanced, and there is all kinds of different ways in which intellectual property can actually also support open science and vice versa. So I think I might stop here because I would like to answer to any questions that you may have. I do, invite you to check our website to see about this, open science working groups that we are, that we have. As I said, they are open to everybody, so very keen to have people from, again, representing different communities and also different regions to be part of these working groups. And if there is anything that you would like to flag to us in this context, we are always there to respond and to listen to what you have to say in the context of open science, open data, and others. So, Christine, I think I'm going to stop here. I hope this was useful, and I'm happy to respond to any questions that we may have.
Yes, thank you so much, and thanks again for joining us as part of this distinguished speaker series from the National Science Data Fabric and Go Fair US. It's so wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with you and ask you questions live. I want to invite all of the attendees to use the Q&A tool or through our Slack channel. For those of you who are on that, send your questions. If it's okay, I'll start with one, Anna. So you mentioned that as we find with so much of computing, it's the socio-technical, right? Not the technical, that's the hard part. Can you Is there anything that you can share about cross-cultural challenges along the way, or things that had to be that maybe terms that didn't mean the same thing to different people, and how you overcame that to come up with the recommendations?
I think maybe there was a trust issue that we needed to address from the beginning, because there was no clear understanding of what open meant, and what the impact could be on different communities, different nations. I think one of the biggest challenges we had was to make it very clear that it doesn't mean just putting everything out there. And then again, we have an issue where those that are more powerful and have more technological, that are more technologically advanced, can just take and do whatever they want with the information that is out there. So there was a little bit of a pushback in the beginning around those particular issues of, is everything open? What does that mean? What do you do with data, the security related the data that have implications for national security or for privacy, etc. So I think once we've discussed some of these issues and come up with clauses which kind of say what open science is and what it is not, it was easier to move forward in our discussions. At the same time, I think that we were in a way lucky, because the consultations around the recommendation were happening during COVID times, pandemics. And it was very clear that open science really can make things move faster. It can open up collaborations. You can do things faster. It's more efficient. You gain on time. You gain on resources. Access to information was very clear that that's something that is necessary, particularly with regards to information that is produced from research which is funded through public money. So the question of access then becomes even more obvious. So I think the overall COVID situation in that sense was in a way helpful for people to have more understanding of, yes, if we have more collaborations, more openness, more access, more equity in the way we do science, if we talk science more to the global community, it actually is something that is beneficial for everybody.
It's so true. Data really had its moment during the pandemic, and I hope that we can keep riding that wave to convince people that open science is worth doing. I know one issue is that open science is great when you want to use other people's data. Open science is hard when it's your data that you need to share and make fair and all of those good things.
But again, this is what I was referring to in the change of the overall culture of science. It's a matter of what values you give to certain practices that you do, right? So if collaborating becomes a value, then sharing is something that will come very, very obviously, right? If competition is more of a value than collaboration, then yeah, you're going to change, turn around and do things differently. So it really is a matter of kind of shifting culture of science and promoting values, yes, that go towards collaborations, towards kind of contribution to society, rather individual gains or competition or other issues. So it is a cultural shift that needs to happen as well.
I was really excited to hear that you're developing a checklist or a resource for data in times of crisis. I know that when I was at the same event, I was surprised to learn some things that I hadn't thought of before, which I hope you don't mind me sharing.
Mm-hmm.
We had Perihan Alif Ekmeki, who came, and she discussed data in times of crisis isn't just about public good, that it also includes the values of autonomy, diversity, cultural values, vulnerabilities, and the right to information. Are there any other previews with data in times of crisis that you might share or dangle out there so that we keep watching?
So we, as I said, we do have a little community which is very interested in producing this guide or fact sheet on data in times of crisis. But we do usually share it more broadly before we finalize any of our guides. And I think in this particular case of sharing of data in times of crisis, we will try to find a consultative way to, again, get the inputs from the data community, from different aspects of data community, so that we consolidate it in a way that makes sense for everybody who needs to use it later on. Because one of the issues, I think, I mean, one of the kind of benefits of the recommendation is that it's an international document that you can use to promote your work on open data. It really should be a useful document for those who are already doing open science. So the same with this guide on data sharing in times of crisis. We want to make it useful for those who already are trying to do that, but need to convince their institutions or the funders or others to also pick up and adhere to these to these kinds of principles themselves as well. Yeah.
I know you showed us the values and principles surrounding open science in the recommendations. Can you say any more about the power of open science, especially for lower and middle income countries?
Sure. I mean, that was one of the arguments for pushing open science through UNESCO, which is an international organization that 193 member states, many of them in lower and middle income countries. And again, I think that there is a real potential of open science to contribute to science development in those countries. But again, it really does have to be done in an equitable way, particularly because, as I was saying before, the open science infrastructures for the moment are not equally distributed around the world. So it has to be, it is very important in the context of the development of open science to think about these issues, think about the issues of equity, who has access to what, for what purposes, and how do we make sure that in the end we are in a space that promotes equitable and equitable science and equity in terms of access to information. And we really want to try and see how we can promote international collaborations in science more, because it really is fundamental for the advancement of science, particularly if we want to tackle some of these issues that are global, that have implications in different places. It is very difficult not to understand these implications if we don't work across countries, if we don't have different scientists from different countries working together. So again, valuing these collaborations and valuing and acknowledging properly contributions from scientists from developing countries, valuing their work, making it more visible is something that we are really striving through the implementation of the open science recommendation as well. And we kind of we would like to make a call to everybody working with scientists, particularly from developing countries, to make an extra effort in terms of raising visibility of their research and acknowledging them for what they have contributed to the research, the joint research.
Thank you so much. Again, if anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A tool. You mentioned that you mentioned a call to the community, and that there are ways to get involved. I know one thing I saw was checklists for universities, and I think many of the attendees are from research institutions. What are some of the other ways that people can can act on this or get involved?
In terms of getting involved really with the international, with what we're doing in the international level, I think, as I said, we regularly have calls for best practices. That we have one that is constantly there because we understand that there is more and more innovation coming in terms of open science practices. So we very much welcome contributions to that. Contributions through the working groups, as I said, are very precious. Ideas on some of the additional guides or briefs, they're also very, very welcome. We're very open to, receiving proposals from different communities. Another way of kind of engaging is also to promote the recommendation, to cite it, to use the definitions that are in the recommendation, particularly for open science. It is a way to promote and at the same time being involved and engaged in that work. And we are actually very happy because we have quite a good feedback from the scientific community more broadly. I believe it's also due to the fact that we had such a broad consultative process where we did try to get inputs from different communities on open science, but we do have a relatively positive feedback from the scientific community who, again, find the recommendation useful and therefore raise awareness in what they are doing or using it to be able to do it even more in terms of their own work on open science.
Thank you, and that's a good reminder. Here in the US, it's the year of open science, and we have a distributed set of federal agencies that are working to implement this, but they all work together through the Office of Science and Technology Policy that last year issued a memo that we call the Nelson Memo that is called for all funding agencies, which is pretty much all the funding agencies of a certain level of funding, to put out new public access plans. And so, long story short, several of us will be changing how we do our data management and sharing plans, and that's a great opportunity to cite the UNESCO recommendation on open science in there and use some of those definitions as you're describing things. We do have a question from the audience, and Anna, you should be able to see it in the Q&A tool, but I'll read it. As you indicated, alignment of incentives and funding mechanism, et cetera, around data sharing are essential for advancing open science and shifting the culture. Presumably, your collection of best practices is a work in progress, but do you have some preliminary best practices or funding mechanisms that you can share?
Indeed, I mean, it is a work in progress, and we are looking into all the different options. There are, I mean, in Europe currently, there is a big push towards open science through their funding mechanisms, with funders requiring open access, publishing in open access journals, and also data sharing. One of the issues that we may have with such a kind of top-down approach is that you also need to make sure that your researchers have the capacity to be able to do open data sharing, stewardship, everything that goes with it, which is not necessarily something that you just do, that you do have structures within the research institutions that can help and assist. And this is one of the issues that we have, particularly in developing countries, where they're saying that this lack of infrastructures and the lack of capacity for the promotion of open science, and particularly data sharing and open data sharing, is something that is lacking. So we now see different countries coming up with their open science policies or integrating open science principles in their existing science, technology, innovation policies, with some requirements also for investment and skills development for open data sharing, for all the kind of additional actions that are needed from researchers if they want to do open science properly. So I think in terms of good practices, those that in a way combine policies, incentives, and funding all in kind of a same package is something that really can move the needle. There is not that many of them, but there are some European countries that are going in the right direction. And I mean, we are encouraged by what is happening in the US and very much looking forward to seeing how that is going to evolve in the future. What is the new skill set that is needed so that the researchers can indeed implement what is in the Nelson memo? And as you were saying, Christine, you will have to change some of your practices. Are you equipped with skills and resources to be able to do that? I think that's going to be an interesting evolution to see in the US, and probably a lot of things we will be able to learn from that process as well.
Well, we've seen the beginning of it because our National Institutes of Health implemented their new data management and sharing plan as of January 1st. And I had an opportunity, instead of just being an evangelist talking about these topics, I was a researcher who had to fill out one of these. And I really give them high marks. They ask the hard questions. You can't just copy and paste what you've been saying for years into your proposal. It's, what are the metadata standards you're going to use? Where are you going to deposit this data? There's no getting out of giving specifics. And I think some of those questions that they have are going to drive researchers in labs to talk about their data practices. And we've heard that NSF plans to follow suit, at least in renaming their plan to data management and sharing. So, well, yes, stay tuned.
No, it's really interesting. And another thing that we are looking into is, and that was really pushed forward by the data community while we were discussing the recommendation, is how to, and at which point in the education cycle do you integrate for researchers all the different skills and competencies that they have to have for data management and sharing. So we will be working on like a skills framework and would love to get your inputs as well, because it is true that the curricula will have to change. It will be very difficult for researchers to come to the lab doing their research at the later stage and only then learn about metadata. What does that mean? How do you curate? How do you don't? What are the repositories, etc.? This will have to happen before in their education cycle. So we will be looking into what are the skills that are necessary and at which stage of their education cycle they will have to get it, to be able to also work with the ministries and trying to see how do you change the curricula to integrate again this open science in the education curricula, particularly for researchers.
Thank you so much. Well, and I made a note because I hope to get involved in that. We get a lot of questions through GoFair US where people ask, how can I learn about this? Or can I go to some intensive training? And at the moment, most of these programs are in Europe and there aren't a lot of them. It's not something that you can just watch the 30-minute video and now I'm an expert. We have a question from Kamal Chowdhury who asks, what are the security challenges of open science data?
I think we touched upon that a little bit. And it's a matter of how do you release and how do you share potentially sensitive data. Again, the recommendation is very clear into saying you have to think about which data you share, how and with whom and with which protocols and under what kind of rules or regulations. And it has been a lot of community protocols that have been developed for specific data sharing. we are concerned, like everybody is, with like data mining and then the use of data which is in open access for commercial benefits without the original data providers getting any benefits back from that. So these are some of the issues that, of course, are still being discussed. Um, but again, there are ways of tracking the use of data sets and regulations that can be put in place to minimize any risk that you can have with open data sharing.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's a quandary, but at least sharing that data exists in metadata can be an important step, even if you can't put all of the data out there.
And there is a lot of data that can be shared. Like we've been looking, I've been trying to push everybody to give me some percentage of, what is the amount of data that I don't have the percentage yet, but there is a lot of data from research that can be openly shared, really for the benefit of science, for the benefit of specific communities within science, but also beyond the scientific community. It shouldn't be an excuse not to share, because maybe there may be an issue with some specific data sets. I mean, what I think is really that we have to share, we have to develop these community protocols, and then regulate what needs to be regulated, and then leave the rest really for sharing and for collaborations. I think we're going to get much more out of that than keeping the information not shared, not fair.
Thank you. Well said. And I think many of the people who joined agree with you today. Hopefully all. Any last thoughts or things that you wished you'd been asked about?
No, I think that's good. It was a pleasure to be able to talk to you. Again, you can always contact me by email if you have any additional questions, or if you want to join us. I would be very, very happy to connect you also to other colleagues and to the other networks that are working with us on some of these issues.
Well, with that, let me close the webinar, and thank you again so much for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Anna Persic, for being one of our distinguished speakers in this series. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Bye-bye.
Bye.